mission in the early church, of course, was almost entirely, in the first church, was almost entirely within Jerusalem. That Jerusalem got fairly quickly to about 10,000 members within really the temple context, probably about 10% of the population of Jerusalem at the time. And it was a tragedy, really, that the vision that the Apostle Paul has of the kind of a profound unity between Jew and Gentile in Christ, symbolized by the collection that he takes up, that he brings to Jerusalem, and that Romans 9, 10, 11 material about the blessing coming to the Gentiles to make Israel jealous so that Israel would come to Christ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of that stuff. Seems to have faded a little bit within a few generations, actually, and there's sort of this deep hostility, curses pronounced by Jews on a regular basis upon Christians, and yet at the same time, the contextualization that was needed to be done in that very first context, the transition between Judaism with all of its framework and what you might call messianically fulfilled Judaism, which is what you see lived out in the context of the Jerusalem church, wasn't that far a transition at one level. We have a very different challenge. Our challenge is much greater on the contextualization front, and what I want to do in this session is to take it from the fairly heady. I understand that where we were talking there in the last session was relatively abstract, or down the abstract end of things. I'll try and get down the other end of things at this time and talk about, much more straightforwardly, evangelism in a post-Christian environment, and start by just saying we're not in Kansas anymore, which is a quote, of course, from The Wizard of Oz. We're not in Kansas anymore. Back in Christendom, oh happy day. I don't know, actually. I'm not sure. I think that there were some pretty significant challenges to Christendom. The gospel and power, especially political power, really don't seem to combine very well very frequently. There might be great examples of politicized gospel power in the history of the world. None immediately spring to mind. But what it meant was that the context for disciple making in Christendom had its own particular kind of shape. Sunday schools of 500, 600, 700 kids were regarded as small back in Australia in the 1950s. There was a plaque at the church where I served, which was initially was St Barnabas Broadway, right next to Sydney University, and there was the building burnt down. I think this plaque survived, and the plaque was for a Sunday school superintendent whose name I forget, but he was the plaque read Sunday school superintendent for 40 years, and then a biblical quote, "With Christ, which is better by far." Then being 40 years the Sunday school superintendent, I think that's probably true, actually, because there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids would just be brought along. In England for a while, I believe this is the case, and not too long ago ended, you got fined if you didn't have your child baptized. I believe that's the case. Fined by the government if you didn't have your child baptized. That's state and church pretty closely embedded with one another. And the challenges of mission in those contexts and evangelism are of a certain sort. It's about nominalism, really. That's not our problem. There are virtually no nominals in church anymore. In Christendom, you did much of your evangelism to the churchgoers, because as long as everyone recognised that 50% of the church was not believers, they were just there because of social pressure or whatever. So I visited a church in Austin, Texas. So where there are still pockets of Christendom around in the Western world at this point, and Austin, Texas is one of them. Large church. I think if you spit, then a church grows in Texas. This church was, I think about 6,000, something like that, so medium size. And talking to the pastor, they just know that, a third to a half of the people in church each week are not believers, which just gives them a pretty clear evangelistic task to do, isn't it? To evangelize the couple of thousand people each week that turn up to church, but who have been magnificently inoculated against the gospel by having turned up for the last 30 years to church. And so the challenge of evangelism in Austin, Texas, has a very particular kind of shape to it. How to get through the inoculation. Because the one thing you can be sure is if you tried persuading any of those 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 people that they weren't Christians, they'd get slightly, if not brutally offended, and given concealed carry licenses abound, in Texas, and everyone's packing heat in church, that might be an interesting little moment for you. That's not our problem. There are hardly any nominals in church anymore, in a post-Christian, secular environment. There are believers, there are inquirers or seekers, those on the fringe. You might call them God-fearers or parallel to God-fearers, as we see in the Acts of the Apostles, but not many nominals. We're not in Kansas anymore. It's just different. And in a context where every word you said about the Christian gospel made some sense, God, Creator, sin, hell, heaven, terrible word, heaven, right? Almost always means floaty, dualistic souls going off and doing their thing. In my view, heaven is a dead word. I don't use it ever. I taught my kids to say glory from the very moment that they could speak. And I think heaven is a dead word. You can't dissociate it from floaty soul dualism. And so I think we just have to give it up. That's my view. But all of those words made sense in a former age. Even cross and resurrection and justification and God, these words all made sense. Now, for almost everyone, they make almost no sense. They're just not part of their vocabulary. They would never use them during the course of any ordinary day. They don't form part of their necessary language to talk about their lives. They don't find these words or categories valuable in making decisions or in assessing options that they have or in reflecting on how to live in relationships. They're just not words they use anymore. They're not categories they use anymore. We're not in Kansas anymore. And that makes the challenge of personal evangelism or church evangelism pretty interesting. I said I want to get you to do some work because it's the post-lunch session, and so I'm going to get you to do some work. What I want to present to you is a table so this is just I've taken down from a session I was with Tim Keller recently in April, which I just found a fascinating way into the questions and challenges. He set up a table. This is mostly what he does. It's what all good philosophers do, is you create categories by taking reality and dividing it up into its proper categories and then allowing those categories to relate to each other and intersect with each other. And so he said, well, look, roughly in a kind of historical overview, there'd be debates about exactly what years these things start or stop. I don't think there are years that these things start or stop. Pre-Christian, Christendom, modernity or early post-Christian, and late modernity or deep post-Christian represent in a Western context something like before 300 AD, Constantine wins the Battle of Milvian Hill, I think it is, the Roman emperor, or at least he defeats his brother. And the night before, he saw a cross in a dream, and with these words, "By this sign conquer." So that next day, he had everyone print a cross on their shield. And the irony of printing a cross on your battle armaments is just kind of particularly interesting, I find. And then he went out and did conquer by that cross and became the Roman emperor, and then started persecuting pagans and instituting the Christianity as the state religion. And that's called Christendom. So pre-312, I think, was the Battle of Milvian Hill. Christendom Bridge or Hill? Bridge, yes. There's pre-Christian for what? 300 to, pick a date, Descartes, Kant, someone 1700s, 1800s, somewhere in there. It's mandatory, socially mandatory to be Christian, effectively. The Enlightenment takes place. That's just you just got to have a lot of, hubris to name yourself the Enlightenment, I think, because that's what they did. They called themselves the Enlightenment. Well, wasn't later historians that called them the Enlightenment. They themselves declared themselves to be the Enlightenment. And what's before the Enlightenment? Pardon me. The Endarkenment. That's right. The Dark Ages. And that's just beautiful rhetoric, very good propaganda. And the Enlightenment begins this sort of post-Christendom time, but it's all about the reign of reason, the capacity of human beings to simplify and clarify things down to their fundamental and constituent elements, beginning with the method of Newton. There's that wonderful poem by Alexander Pope about Newton. All was in darkness, and then God said, "Let Newton be," and there was light. And Newton represents the sort of the archetypal modernist method to break everything down to its constituent parts and figure it all out and then put it all back together. And we human beings with our independent rationality can figure stuff out, and we can do it. And we don't need the enemy of progress is tradition. The enemy of understanding is faith. And so the modernity was a great enemy to Christianity. It regarded Christianity as the enemy. And regarded itself as the Enlightenment. And that was all fine until some people started saying, well, actually, doesn't modernity turn out to be just a little bit too totalizing and just a little bit oppressive of anyone else? And actually, it's strange how it's so many dead white men who seem to have decided what's true about everything, everywhere. What about the non-whites? And what about the non-men? Are there any of those? And can they think or contribute? And there's sort of the exposure of the emperor with no clothes, modernity, as this attempted claim to unbiased and pure rationality, turns out to be a lot of power serving, a lot of self-justifying, a lot of self-interest, and suddenly the whole notion that there's this process of a non-biased, independent, objective rationality that everyone just will agree with and no one can differ from, and if you disagree with it, then you're insane. The definition of insanity is to be irrational. Actually, instead, what we have is pluralism, this kind of great plurality of there's no truth except your truth. What's true for you is true for you. Remember that? What's right for you is right for you. Very interestingly, actually, I think we might be in post Christianity, where it's not what's right for you is what's right for you anymore. Actually, we're sort of emerging out of that. Very interesting. What Tim Keller did was he said, all right, there are these eras that are characterized by those sorts of approaches, and he wanted to ask the question, all right, what's the attitude towards Christianity from within that culture, within that context, that era? Secondly, what kind of moral values are there within each of those eras? And what's the nature of religious consciousness within each of those eras? Okay, so what you can see what he's done there, he's identified the eras, and we're going to talk about post-Christian, deep post-Christian, which is where we are now, at least here in New Zealand, and ask these three questions. And the reason for asking the three questions of the three prior eras is it just skills you a little bit at thinking through the question. What was the attitude towards Christianity? What were the nature of moral values in each of these eras and what was the level of or capacity for religious consciousness. So what I want to do is, I told you I'm going to get you to do some work, so I want you to fill in the table. Now, so turn with a group and actually have a go at filling in the table. So what have you come up with? Sometimes the answer can be, sorry? Maybe, sure. Okay. So, sometimes the answer might be, don't know. I don't know what the attitude towards Christianity was under a pre-Christian context. When you think pre-Christian, of course, in the West that means prior to 300. In Japan that means 2019. Right? So Japan is pre-Christian now. It hasn't had Christendom. Korea, hard to know. Only 25% of Korea is in church on Sunday. That's down from 50%, which is what it used to be in the middle of the 20th century. So that's hard to know. Kenya? Anyway, you see the point I'm making. Kenya, right now, isn't it? Massively. Nigeria? In the north? Yeah, pre-Christian Islam, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of 7th century Middle East. So this is the reason I didn't put dates on this is because where you are depends on what date goes with it. So, what's the attitude towards Christianity in a pre-Christian context? Yeah, scorned. What others come up with? Curiosity, I think, is an interesting idea. I suspect that curiosity is only possible if Christianity is not perceived as a threat to everything that matters. And I suspect that for many in a pre-Christian context, Christianity was perceived very much as a threat. It's just because we're highly Christianized that we can't imagine Christianity as a threat. How can Christianity be a threat? Sure. And so what they call the plausibility structure, the plausibility of Christianity impressed itself upon those who found themselves with an antagonism towards it that they had to overcome in light of, remember, the community experience, the social ethic and the personal ethic and the inclusive community, and along with a contextualized theological vision. Yes, they overcame these things. So maybe it's from antagonism to curiosity. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Good? Yes, to be suppressed. Often ignorant of it, yep. I wonder whether one way to sort of sum up all of these things, did I see more pens, is to say that as a result of all of it, there's a real cost to being a Christian in a pre-Christian context. You pay a price. You pay a price in social respectability and mobility. You can pay a price actually in physical terms, in persecution terms. When you're in this context here, to be a Christian is a costly exercise. Yeah, okay. Under Christendom, what's the attitude to Christianity? Yes. Mandatory? Yeah. Certainly affirmed. There may even be some here who remember this. I remember just being a kid and going shopping on a Sunday morning. Did you experience this? What happened when you were a kid and you went shopping on a Sunday morning? You didn't, because everything was shut by law, so that there was only one venue open for business on a Sunday, which was the church. We had a mandated monopoly on entertainment on a Sunday. pubs were shut. You didn't have to be very entertaining when you got a monopoly. You know what monopolies do to markets? They really distort markets. Yep, good. Yes. And so, I mean, I think under here we can get a sense that there's really a pressure, isn't there, to be Christian. And I think we have a sense of the cost of this. The price you pay for this pressure is people who are Christian out of pressure, not Christian out of conviction. And as I think it's a genuine question as to whether this is on a net positive situation or a net negative situation. Yeah. And it's interesting the way that social changes like that can flip really quite quickly under certain circumstances.
I'm aware that the answer is a long history, not just the short one.
Right. Well, not particularly in that I don't want to. I mean, these blur, particularly down this end, they sort of blur into each other a little bit more. The sexual revolution, and particularly the pill, I think, which are technological products, at least the pill, I think have massive social consequences along these lines. And what happens is that you reach a tipping point of plausibility within the culture, which says what used to make sense, it just made sense. Christianity made sense. And then suddenly, it just doesn't make sense anymore. Everything about our lives are moving on and changing in such a way that the Christian narrative or story ceases to be the obvious and logical thing. It becomes the weird and crazy thing. But we have to do more. So I'm going to keep going. Under modernity, which, like I say, is sort of, there are some aspects of Christendom that bleed through into the 1950s, right? So that, but at the same time, you've got a very hostile enlightenment going on from the late 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. So these are not neat categories, and you can't do history quite like this, and it doesn't work to just draw a line down a page and all that kind of stuff. What's the situation under sort of modernity?
Begins to become irrelevant.
Right, so there's the emerging irrelevance. Doubt, yeah, crazy, and leading into skepticism even. Right? Right, and irrational. And yet, what are some of the other things? Could you be the President of the United States without being a Christian? Up until... It's kind of interesting question, isn't it? Can you be the Prime Minister of New Zealand without being a Christian from 60s? 70s? Okay. And I don't mean strong Christian, I just mean Christian affirming. So it's interesting that there's was not relevant. Yeah, okay. Good. If you were an outspoken atheist, would that have raised questions about your reliability or your character? You can see how this is a kind of a transition moment, isn't it? There's I wonder if there's some kind of, you might call this, you can put it either of two ways: declining social benefit. It's still the case that, if you're a Christian, at least if you're not an atheist, that's better than being an atheist for a little while at least. Or at the same time, it's increasing irrelevance or marginalisation. Under a post-Christian environment, what's the attitude towards Christianity? Ambivalent at best, perhaps?
That's great, you're a Christian.
Yes, and what's the tolerance of?
You being silent.
So there's a tolerance of private Christianity as long as you don't bring it into the public square. So you can't base your policies as a company on being a Christian. Are you allowed to discriminate against non-Christians as a Christian school here in New Zealand? So you can still, in Australia, we have,
My kids go to a Christian school and they have a 2% threshold where non-Christians can be in that school.
and they don't fall foul of anti-discrimination legislation?
It's a special character.
Special character, okay. Right, otherwise you lose your special character.
Yeah.
Right, yes, there's a sort of interesting symbiosis there, isn't there? How long before it becomes a government issue in New Zealand that, hey, sure, special character, but what about excluding a person, a gay or transgender person from teaching in a Christian school? Is that permitted? Right. Right. Yep. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So tax deductions are still a little Christendom hangover, aren't they? Yeah. Even now.
Great.
Spoken like a good tax deductor. They're great. Yes. Right now, we've got in Australia with our federal election this Saturday, one party saying we will remove exemptions from the anti-discrimination legislation, and the other party saying we'll retain exemptions from the anti-discrimination legislation. And so, and the Labor government will get in, I'm pretty sure, and they'll move on that, and that will be a pretty interesting little moment. I don't think it's a bad thing myself, but for various reasons, but it's an interesting moment. Right. Yeah, yeah. Sure. Yeah. In Australia, the tax benefits given to churches were led by the Roman Catholic Church that got it through the Labor government on the grounds that if the Roman Catholic Church was taxed like any other non-religious institution, that because the Roman Catholic Church paid its pastors primarily in kind, and so all of that would become tax deductible under the fringe benefits tax law. That would basically put the Roman Catholic Church out of business. That would then mean that all the social services that the Roman Catholic Church delivered would go out of business, and that would mean the government would have to pick up all of those social services, which would cost it 100 times more than the tax that it got from the Roman Catholic Church. And so they said, you know what? Let's keep the Roman Catholic tax deductions in place, shall we? But of course, once they've got the Roman Catholic tax deductions in place, that's got to be generalised across to all. And so the reason that the tax deductibility for issues for religious organisations in Australia are preserved is because they provide social services that governments depend upon. In fact, the total social infrastructure, there's one estimate that the social infrastructure of Australia will collapse within 3 days if churches stopped providing social services to church and church organisations stopped providing social services to the country. 3 days.
Review in Auckland did exactly the same thing.
Right.
Did a review in Auckland and said if the churches stopped providing the social services, council could not afford to pick up.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting the way that in a pre-Christian society that stands out massively. In a post-Christian society, it's taken for granted. And so our radically inclusive community and radically progressive social ethic, et cetera, of caring for the poor and not just our own and all that kind of stuff, here was mind-blowing, was world-changing. Here, for all of this time, it's now become just taken for granted. Of course, that's the way things are. As part of the story, absolutely. Yeah. Mind you, there's plenty of entitlement by Christians about their tax deductions too. For the ignorant, the RSA means? Right, okay. Wanted a Muslim prayer at RSA services on Anzac Day. Yeah, right. Where do they belong? Yeah, that's here. That's what this is about. Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah, good. Yeah, fascinating. And, what level of involvement ought the church to have in a national military remembrance? How many people still have national flags in their church buildings? Anyone have national flags? A few. That's a pretty interesting thing, isn't it, to have a flag of a nation state in a church where there is no Greek or Jew or New Zealander or at this point. Anyway. Right. Right. And I speak with a near total ignorance at this point. I think what I see there is a kind of a very interesting clash between, on the one hand, the prohibition of Christian hegemony or sort of imposition, on the other hand, a massive fear of racial prejudice. And so when you've got a racial or ethnic minority, I don't know whether that's not the right way to put it in New Zealand about Maori, but a kind of a Maori thing, to stop a Maori thing, you don't do that, even when that's a Christian thing, which you would stop in some other place. And so that's a nice little intersecting clashing of values, which is just great to play with. Like really, really force people to sort of engage with the reality of that and what's going on there. Good. Post-Christian, keep going just down this track. Fill this in. It certainly can be. Just post something like Israel Folau. Lose your job. Lose your job for quoting the Bible. I did a marriage service on Saturday where I said marriage is between a man and a woman as a gift of God. I did. I said that. No, I really did. And if I said that in certain places, I would get sued or sacked. But if I say it inside the church building, it's like there's a cone of silence around the church, and I'm allowed to say it there. And so when does something become illegal according to the geography of where you say it? No. In other words, back to cost. Isn't that interesting? Except here, it's cost with all the assumptions about what churches will do and the entitlement that goes with that. What about moral values? Under a pre-Christian context or a traditional society, what's the nature of moral values? And what did the class system do in a society? What does a class system do in a society? It preserves inequality, although would they call it inequality? It creates order. In other words, the interesting thing about a pre-Christian society is that their moral values are extremely high and traditional, and traditionalist. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and if you do the wrong thing, you get taken out the back and you get the boys come around and beat you up. And that's just how things are, and that's how it's supposed to be. So high, I'm going to call this high traditional. Yeah, I mean, you think about some other, and almost all traditional societies are religious societies. Right? Secularism is such a new phenomenon. moral ambivalence is not a feature of a traditional religious society. Right. Yes. Y- And so the issue there is not so much um, what are the morals that are being upheld, it's the attitude towards those morals, which is you offend and you just really pay for it. Under Christendom, ah, cheers. Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? Inherited Christian values, good. Right, which is a nice captured in that word inherited, isn't it? It's fairly a traditional approach. There's in theory some grace involved in forgiveness. You had confession. Um, I wonder whether you could put this as these are traditional values, but not in quite the same high sense as here. Under modernity, what's the attitude the sort of moral stance?
Begins to be boss is your own destiny.
Right. Um, uh, choose.
I just said this era still has a high morality. Um, Intellectually, this is going on, but actually,
Yes.
traditional family, traditional schools, traditional kind of everything. They were trying to hold things, but
Yeah. So there's still an element of traditional moral here, although it's beginning to tail off a little bit, isn't it? At least in the language. Under late modernity, collapse, experimental, flux. Second. Yes, new sexualities. Yep. And so you might summarize this by saying progressive.
imposed tolerance.
Yes, yes. Yes. And that is a very, I think, interesting observation. The triumph of the individual over the community, and in particular, even one way you might say this, which is a virtual inability to conceive of communities, of imagined communities, other than communities of choice or communities of affinity. So gamers are a community, and um, the gay community is a community, but these are communities of choice, not communities of geography or of blood relationships. They're communities of choice. I want to keep going.
Can we say regressive instead of progressive?
Yeah, okay, regressive. That's interesting. What do you mean? What do you have in mind when you say that?
Well, it's a phrase that this journalist in London uses to describe the aggressive nature of progressive left as he sees it, even though he was a candidate for the Liberal Party in the UK recently, so he's not conservative himself. But there's this kind of, the Southern Poverty Law Centre?
I do not.
So a famously liberal outfit in the US. He was recently put by them on a list of people who are haters of Islam. He's a practicing Muslim himself, but an ex-radical. So he then took them to court over it, and they backed down and paid him several $1 million
Awesome.
apology fees to him.
Awesome.
So he's not conservative, but he's not the radical
Right.
either. So he labels the progressives
Regressives. Yes. The value here is freedom, isn't it? The value, whatever that means, however that's conceived. We say, of course, it's the truth that will set you free, and it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. But the sort of the mantra of freedom is what defines. What about religious consciousness here? Very high under Christendom. High post-Christendom. Low and under a post-Christian, deep post-Christian context. What Keller said was absent. Yeah. And I think that's right. Whether that's doing the job that religion did, if I can put it like that, or whether it's just how's the rating of this building? 62%. 2. Okay, same as that one. I think this is a massively interesting phenomenon, identity politics, which is all about a whole bunch of things, but particularly victimhood and creating the categories of victimhood, and then finding the capacity to appropriate one of those categories to oneself, and then making that one's identity, because that positions oneself in a situation of being unattackable, unassailable. I'm not sure whether I want to call it a religious consciousness, though. It's another kind of consciousness, a very important one, but not a particularly religious consciousness.
There's a spirituality, though.
Yeah, there can be, can't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of spirituality.
Yeah.
Not Christianity, but there is a hunger for spiritual things.
And so yoga.
Yeah. Look at all the New Age stuff. So there's a
I think there's a high religious, an increasing religious consciousness, to be honest now.
Okay.
Religious, I'm not talking necessarily Christian.
No, sure.
But in terms of religious, if I go back 15, 20 years ago, and you said you were a Christian out there, people would not want to really engage with you. But now there's actually a consciousness of religion in a real, and I don't care about the label. I think there's quite an increase in
Okay.
religious consciousness.
Good. Interesting. At the back. Yes, that's a good question. I wonder whether one way to get at the question is to ask what is the function of religion. So this is kind of religious sociology, and whether spirituality does or doesn't perform those functions.
I think so long as your spirituality has a healthy vagueness to it.
Right.
So long as it's vague,
Yes,
it's good.
and in particular, I do. The thing that's occurring to me to wonder about, I'm not sure what I think about this, is whether spirituality is almost always and almost entirely conceived of as internal to the person, whereas I wonder whether religious consciousness has about it and something to do with an external reality, and so that what's happened is that a religious consciousness has been replaced by a spiritual consciousness that aren't the same thing, that make the evangelistic task, because that's what we're talking about eventually. That's what make the evangelistic task not easier under a religious consciousness. There's some points of contact and entry. Under a spirituality consciousness, I wonder whether it makes it actually more difficult out of the very act of the spirituality. Sorry. Yeah, maybe it'd be interesting that
I mean, probably our evangelism has pandered to that individualizing, hasn't it?
Could do. Yeah, good. I'm not here to. You were.
Yes, I was going to say, look, I don't think absent is the right word. I mean, the social scientists pretty well on max have abandoned the secularization thesis, dominated social science.
Yes. Good.
Pretty well gone. You look at the latest Pew research on Europe, the numbers of people who still self-identify as Christian and still want to be
Yes.
baptized,
Yes.
the numbers of still
Yep.
pay taxes and church taxes in Europe,
Yep.
things like that. It's not, I mean, arguably some of the
Yeah, okay.
So, arguably, I'd say, see what you mean by religious consciousness, because I think it's obvious that institutional religious features are on the nose, but I think that's along with a lot of things that people often say.
Right.
I mean, most of the mediating institutions have been destroyed by bulldozers and vermin, so there isn't a lot left but the state and the individual.
Yeah.
So I would argue absent the right person.
Okay. Good. Yep. And in a sense, I'm not primarily trying to bring a right answer or correct answer or something, but to open up the questions of, in a deeply post-Christian environment, this is the context that we're facing in regard to the attitude towards Christianity, the nature of morality and moral values and how and why they're held, and the sort of underlying religious consciousness. These have a significant impact on the capacity we have, or the starting point that we have in relation to evangelism, whether at a personal one-to-one level or in a church level, at an outreach event or in church service or something like that. What answers you come up with for these, and they may well be different here in New Zealand as compared even to Australia, just across the ditch. And certainly could be different in Europe, which is, in some ways a deeper secularism, although I take your point, I've heard research to indicate that the inherited Christianity through the church structures is declining, but the chosen Christianity of individual conversion is on the incline, is on the increase. So I take your point. I'm going to leave this now, just because I'm aware of time, and I thought we had till 3:30. So 3:15. Okay, you're so kind. I've just read a very interesting book which I want to draw to your attention about questions. A fascinating book about moral questions, debates, and disputes called "The Righteous Mind" by a guy called Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. He makes a number of points throughout the book. He's a left-leaning, wannabe understander of conservative morality, which is a very, very interesting place to come from. I think he has a secular version of what is a summary of Thomas Cranmer that a scholar called Ashley Null has popularised, which is that what the heart desires, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. And Haidt says that actually people don't make their judgments, especially their moral judgments, on the basis of thought-through positions, their mind, which they then lead into a decision and a moral judgment. He says it's the other way around entirely. People make moral judgments based on intuition, and they then use their minds to come up with post hoc justifications of the intuitive decision that they've already made, and that we're all doing that all the time. And there's all sorts of interesting psychological experiments that they do to indicate that. In other words, he's saying that rational arguments are persuasive to people who are already persuaded and completely unpersuasive to people who don't want to be persuaded. And whether they're persuadable or not has got nothing to do with the argument. It's got to do with their gut instincts underneath, and in particular what they regard as plausible. And one of the points he makes is what they will regard as plausible has as much to do with the kind of relational webs that they're embedded in. And it's a book about politics, so he says if there's a person who's left-leaning who has a friend who's right-leaning, they will find arguments from a conservative position to be much more persuasive than a person who's left-leaning and has no right-leaning friends, because it's their intuition, which is shaped by their social context as much as anything else, that shapes their judgments and especially their moral values. Yeah, right. And there's a kind of that's right. So fascinating. Again, just reinforces the importance of community, and in particular, perhaps the way that people belong often before they believe. So my vision of evangelism for many years was equip Christian people to go out to their friends and neighbours and colleagues. They would evangelize until they became Christians, and then they'd bring them to church. Absurd. Totally naive. As if that's how it happens. And so the most recent thing we've done in our church is that we've started a soccer club. And so we play soccer on a Saturday afternoon where blokes can do what blokes do best, which is stand shoulder to shoulder and sort of sweat together. And so we go off and sweat, and then we drink in the pub. And the non-Christians that we're inviting from our language classes, our English classes that we run, so that who are South American actually, and therefore really good soccer players. Not that we're interested in that, of course, I just want to say. But we are mid-table, so that's good. What we're creating is a plausibility structure of here's some people who get community and do community well and actually live a normal life, and the more that they interact with that, what Haidt says is the more they're likely to find the Christian thing plausible, our arguments aren't going to create the plausibility for it. So that's the first thing Haidt says. The second thing he says is that there are 6 different, what he calls moral taste buds. I don't know if this is true, but he says that your tongue has 5 different taste bud receptor types: sweet and sour and salty and bitter and one other. And what is it? Yeah, that's the one. And in the same way, you likewise have 6 moral taste bud receptor types along care, harm, liberty, oppression, oh dear, I typed this badly, fairness and cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and sacredness and degradation. They do all sorts of fascinating experiments about, it's quite unpleasant, doing horrible things to chickens and then eating them, which is designed to create all of your just distaste, and yet if on certain readings you have no reason to call it immoral. I'll leave you to read the book. The point that he makes is that left-leaning people, 80% of their moral assessments are made on the basis of care and harm, 10% on liberty, oppression, and fairness and cheating, and the issues of loyalty, authority, and sacredness are not only not regarded as elements of a moral decision or judgment, they're regarded as immoral in their own right. Whereas conservative people equally base their moral judgments on all 6 criteria. And the point that he makes out of all of this is 2 things. One, it explains why people from the left and the right almost never understand each other. They don't understand each other because the criteria by which they evaluate the moral judgments that each other are making are simply different criteria that are never exposed or talked about. The question that this raised for me is, given a context in which the complaint against Christianity is that Christianity is immoral. Right, that's the main argument against Christianity now, isn't it? That Christianity is immoral. If Christians make a conservative moral case for Christianity to people who are liberal in their moral judgments, then what will happen? We'll simply talk past each other. There will be no connection. And remember, what's our job? Our job is to be intelligible. And so this, I think, will pay very careful reading to better understand the basis upon which a secular, especially left-leaning culture, and I think New Zealand is probably further left to, like the whole New Zealand spectrum is further left than the Australian spectrum. You've got to figure out how to talk about the gospel, which has at its core issues of sacredness and authority and loyalty, which are moral categories that not only don't register for left-leaning people, they regard the very categories as immoral and oppressive. So do you see what a challenge that is for evangelism when the secular critique of Christianity is that it is immoral? And you come back and say, no, it's not immoral. We worship the living and true God who created us and who's set out the way that human beings ought to live. Because, you know, when you're getting a car, you're supposed to drive the car according to the maker's instructions, right? You use that example? Drive the car according to the maker's instructions. That's your moral case. And the secular person says, you wicked servant, you're just trying to oppress people. Do you see how it works? That the very case that you make will be that which deepens their moral rejection of Christianity. Anyway, I think hate has got a lot to offer us. Hate. Jonathan, hate. No hate speech in this country. You know what I mean? I'm just saying we want to eradicate hate speech. I've got another table for you, and I don't know if this is going to. That's still not doing anything. Oh well. What Keller goes on to do is to ask, and we're only going to look at this column from now on, because this is going forward, so I can get rid of all of these three. He asks 4 questions. 1, how do you get people's attention? 2, how do you make Christianity attractive to them? So attention, attractive. How do you convict them of sin or need? And how do you bring alleviation to their need? Or how do you explain the cross? So for deep post-Christian context, with all of this in the ether, how do you get people's attention? How do you make Christianity attractive? How do you convict them of sin and need? The need for Christianity, the need for Jesus. And how do you bring alleviation to their need, which is another way of saying or asking, how do you explain the cross? So why don't you take, instead of in groups this time, just take 5 minutes to just try and get one comment or thought down in relation to each of those questions. Just 4 questions for the deep post-Christian environment, our environment here. How do you get people's attention? How do you make Christianity attractive to them? How do you convict them of sin? How do you bring alleviation to their need? How do you explain the cross? Okay, let's bring some wisdom here from you guys. How do you get attention? Facebook. Do you know, I've often found Twitter and Facebook and Twitter to be really good experiences of reason, calm, discussion and persuasion. Or there's another one which is, how many people at the end of their lives will be saying, I wish I'd spent more time having heated arguments with people I've never met. Or likely to meet. I mean, it's just so stupid, isn't it? So if you ever find yourself having an unpleasant discussion on Facebook, you've failed. Okay, you've just failed. I don't care what you've written. It doesn't matter how clever you are or what. If you're having a heated discussion on Facebook, you have failed. So just stop. Just get out. Delete. You can delete your own posts. Get out. There's one guy in Sydney who just pushes every one of my several thousand buttons. Every one of them. And I tried, and then I failed, and I tried it. So I just don't. I haven't defriended him. I read still, but I just never, ever, ever respond because I'm just not grown up enough to do it well. So one day I will be, and then I can do it. But until then, just don't do it. Don't do it. So no, not Facebook. And I wonder, this I think is crucial, isn't it? Example, to live, I think I'd put in the category of necessary, but not sufficient. The example thing won't crack through in a positive way, but a non-example will reinforce in a negative way. So this is now suddenly into a whole topic called discipleship. It's just a small thing that churches do. It's massive, massive issue. And yet, because we're in a post-Christian environment, we're not a post-Muslim environment or a post-Hindu environment, we're a post-Christian environment, there's still enough whiff in the air of Christianity that you're supposed to and you're expected to behave in a nice Christian kind of a way. And the arguments against Israel Folau are Christian-based arguments. around care and harm, that he's harming gay and transgender kids by his comments which amount to hate speech. So that's a Christian argument about the immorality of what Folau has done, you see. So I think this is crucial, necessary, not optional, necessary. You can undo everything you say by what you do. But there was a lovely meme recently, I don't think he said it. Always evangelize, use words if necessary. Preach the gospel, use words if necessary. The Babylon Bee did it. You know Babylon Bee? Babylon Bee flipped around and said, care for people, do actions if necessary. Care for people, do actions if necessary? It's like, no. Caring for people is action, and evangelizing is words. It mustn't be only words, though. This is necessary but not sufficient. Servanthood, and so that I think is down this category, isn't it? Servanthood, same area or ballpark. Yep, good. And so that's going to be, again, in the same area. It's got to happen in the context of relationships. Very little happens outside the context of relationships in terms of persuasion, and that's because we find tribes and clumps that we hang out with, people that are like us, birds of a feather flock together, our communities of choice, and that just reinforce our moral values, our sense of ourselves as good people, whoever we are. And so the only way, one of the things that he says, notes in the book is that until recently, Republicans and Democrats would sit Monday to Thursday and then would stay in DC on Friday, Saturday and Sunday and would often have socialised with each other across the House. But now, I think it was a Republican, maybe it was Newt Gingrich, said to all the Republicans, go home on the weekends. And so one of the suggestions is that the increase in incivility in American politics is a result of the fact that they don't talk to each other anymore other than arguing with each other and slagging off because they don't have these socials with each other anymore. They just don't find ways of doing it. Two racquetball players might be a Democrat and a Republican, and they can play racquetball together and then have a drink afterwards, and that's a thing. And suddenly you're humanizing the other person instead of demonizing them. And so unless we get out of our little relational clumps, because what's the danger for us? I mean, not that the church has ever been tribal, of course. I mean, we don't exist in little tribes that's not our scene at all, is it? So it's hard enough to get out of our tribal context of denominational or intra-denominational, et cetera, let alone to actually get into our communities. There's a consequence of that, by the way, which is that churches mustn't fill up your entire program. So churches mustn't program so heavily in their own life that they mean that church members have no time to do other things with other people. So I've just bought an apartment, and we had our first annual general meeting on Tuesday night, and I, for my sins, became the treasurer of our strata committee. And I wanted to be on the committee because that will help me get to know. We've got 3 buildings that are part of our thing, and there's 9 people on the strata committee, and that will help me to get to know them, and then beyond them, other people, and I can that's this thing here, right here. Yeah. And hospitality is a really interesting phenomenon. In Sydney, it's on the massive decline. It's very rare for people to invite people over to each other's houses. Almost always you go to a third space. So you meet in town for drinks, or you meet at a coffee shop or something like that. Is it Rosaria Butterworth has got a book out called The Gospel Comes with a Latchkey, House Key, which is a kind of a theological reflection on the gospel, the hospitable God and hospitality. Again, it's here. I want to suggest, well, that does help. The Holy Spirit, yes. The language you use. Now, let me make the suggestion I want to put here, which is to say, I want to suggest that the most significant thing to get people's attention is to ask questions. most Christians care for their unsaved neighbours and friends, relatives, feel nervous about evangelism, and desperately want to do it and feel good about themselves as faithful to Christ. And so what happens when a topic related to spiritual things comes up is that the Christian kind of goes into launch mode. It's like, holy shamoli, it's an opportunity. And it depends on your training. You might have been taught to give your testimony, right? So you dig into your memory, think, I wrote out my testimony in that evangelism training program that we did. Has anyone done an evangelism training program where you had to write out your testimony? And so you then launch, boom, and you make you speak uninterruptedly for 300 seconds, right? And that's a quick testimony. And yet you think in any conversation, when does anyone speak without interruption for 300 seconds? It never happens. So it might not be testimony, it might be you've got your little gospel presentation ready. Boom, off you go. God is the loving ruler of the world. He made us and everyone in it, and we sinned and we rebelled against God. And then what happens is, as you put out like that, all you're doing is giving oxygen, fuel for more rejection of Christianity, I think, typically. My favourite boxer, and again, I don't like violent images, but this one's great, was Mike Tyson. So does anyone remember Mike Tyson? Who was unspeakably great, and the second best thing he did was punch people. The first best thing he did was avoid getting punched. He was about 5'2", that's wide, and about 5'2" high, and he would spend a whole fight ducking and weaving and getting out of. He never stopped. He just ceaselessly moved. He would go so low that someone like Evander Holyfield, one of the 6'6" guy, just couldn't get down to him. He just got out the way, and then he would hit and he would win. And I want to suggest that one of the key things to us to learn at, to skill up at, to skill each other in, to run courses on, is evangelism by not telling the gospel until you're answering a real question. Because most of the questions that people ask are not real questions, they're attack questions. What do you think about Israel Folau? That is not an evangelistic opportunity. That is an opportunity for you to say something that will reinforce their sense of outrage as to what Folau's done. And so the only thing to do, at least initially, is to ask a question. This is great because most non-Christians are even worse thought out about their stuff than Christians are. Okay, you might not think that's possible, but it's true. Most non-Christians are worse thought out about their non-Christianity than Christians are about their Christianity. And so you ask maybe at the most two, but normally just one pinprick question, and they don't know how to answer it. And when they don't know how to answer it, the chances are they'll come back to you with, I don't know. What do you think? And when someone asks you, what do you think, in that way, rather than in an attack way, that's when you have an evangelistic conversation going. Until then, I want to suggest that the way to get people's attention is to ask them questions, because what's attention arousing about asking them questions is that it exposes to their attention the fact that they're not nearly as well thought out as they thought they were, and that their viewpoint is not nearly as obvious as they would make it out to seem. Let me refer to you another book at this point. It's by a guy called Gregory Koukl, Koukl. It's called Tactics. It teaches you in sort of a line-by-line kind of way how to ask questions. It's a really great book. It's a really terrible toned book. The book is smug. It's kind of American, and so it's smug, and it's a little bit offensive in some of the language. It's not very respectful of mental health issues in some of the language that it uses. There's lots of ways in which you need to just sort of chew the meat and spit out the gristle. And there's a bit of gristle there. But the meat is unbelievably good, as it will just teach you and equip you and enable you to run a course on how to teach and equip people in the church where you serve how to ask good questions. So that, I want to suggest, this is a very significant issue here. The way to get attention is specifically by asking questions. And there are 4 kinds of questions that you can ask. There are when questions, which is just to do with history, and they're the safest questions to ask. Ask about a person's experience of things. Did you ever go to church? Have you ever been involved in this? Or what was your experience of Christianity growing up, or something like that? There's what questions, what do you mean? There's why questions, why do you think that? And then there are what Kukul calls leading questions, which are questions where you know where they're coming from because you've heard it before, and you lead them into the way that their point of view doesn't make sense, and then it just opens them up until they go, yeah, I never thought of that. What do you reckon? So Kukul is a great gristly read. But how to get people's attentions is to ask, in post-Christendom, is to ask questions. What did you come up with for how to make Christianity attractive to them? Ask questions. Yes, and eventually, I think that's true, and probably we'd go a long way by asking a lot more questions than we currently do. So I think there's some truth in that. And there's all of this stuff as well. The attractiveness comes out of community and grace and forgiveness and example and relationships and hospitality. That's part of it as well. Being vulnerable, that's right. When you don't know something, say you don't know. Yep. And again, this is all in the example stuff. Necessary, I'd suggest, but not sufficient. How do you make Christianity attractive to them? Right. Yep. Yep. And so, hear my point again. I'm saying, I think, as I say, those things are necessary but not sufficient. They're words, they're deeds, but not words. So I'm saying, let me sharpen my question. How do you make Christianity attractive to them with all of that stuff in place via the words that you speak as you look to proclaim the gospel? Yeah. And in particular, we'll stop here. We won't finish the next 2. We'll come back to those tomorrow, okay, because we need to stop. The suggestion I want to make here is exactly along these lines, which is to say, ask about or talk about what their worldview is seeking. So what's it really after? What is it that the views that they have are trying to, in a sense, achieve or create for them? Here I want to refer you to a book by Keller called Making Sense of God, An Invitation to the Skeptical. So it's a book that's written for the skeptics, for non-Christian people, Making Sense of God. You may know his first book that sort of launched him was a book called The Reason for God. This is a prequel, in a sense, to The Reason for God. And what he does in that book is he tries to dig underneath what is it that a secular worldview is trying to reach for, but often doesn't quite succeed in providing. And so here's an example. What a secular view is trying to reach for at some level is a meaning in life that suffering can't take away. A meaning in life that suffering can't take away. Well, another way to put that is say, on a secular view of life, it's really often the case that secular life only works when you have a very minimal amount of suffering in life. And that suffering kind of brings into pretty fierce problem and question meaning for a secular person. And so one of the ways to make Christianity attractive is to talk about the issue of how to have a meaning in life even in the midst of suffering, especially when you're suffering, or when they're suffering, or when both of you are suffering. Because that's an incredibly powerful thing, to know how to talk about the gospel in terms of something that gives meaning that suffering can't take away. Or again, not unrelated, it's kind of the flip side of it, which is a happiness that's not based on circumstances. So the secular story is one of progress and success, of increasing wealth and capacity and all of that kind of stuff. It's all incredibly based on circumstances. How do you have a happiness in life, a satisfaction in life that transcends and that rises above the ups and downs of circumstances? So do you see, this is talking about particularly what it is that their worldview is reaching for but is not quite able to deliver. It's where there are gaps, where there are overlaps or clashes, a freedom that doesn't eat up love and community. Because the secular view of freedom is, I'm free to do what I want any old time. You know that song? I'm free to do what I want any old time. And that's a really great basis for love and community. How do you have a freedom that frees you to be a person who loves and therefore forges community? That's a genuine issue. We want freedom. Secular people want freedom, but they want community. And so how do those two things go together? And how does the gospel bring freedom and community together? When, according to the Anglican prayer book at least, his service is what? Perfect freedom. To serve God, pun intended, to be a slave to God is perfect freedom. And so you can have freedom and community at the same time. Or an identity that's not fragile. See, one of the really interesting things about an identity that's built on your desires is that A, your desires change all the time, and B, whether you can achieve your desires is incredibly fragile. So how do you have an identity that's not dependent upon your ability to achieve the fulfillment of your desires? Do you see what Keller's trying to do? He's saying, what's a secular view reaching for? Secularism is not stupid. It's not saying, let's try and come up with a way of being in life that really just is rubbish. Right? That's not what secularism is. Secularism is the best effort by really smart people to come up with a way to make their way in this world. And your job is to understand it so well, to get into it so much that you get where it's going, what it's shooting for, and where it falls short, and then ask some probing questions that get inside their worldview and look to complete it. Because who's going to complete it? Just Jesus Christ. And if Jesus Christ can become the solution to their worldview/narrative problems, then you've made Christianity attractive to them. Or in other words, back to talking about contextualization, you've made an argument that even if they don't buy it, they wish it was true. I wish it was true that Jesus Christ meant freedom was compatible with real love and commitment and community. I mean, I'm not sure he is, but that sounds pretty good because I'm after those things.
Ultimately, it's the pursuit of happiness, isn't it? That's what humanity really...
Yeah, I think, in a broad sense, I think happiness understood in terms of, peace. I think there's an incredible desire for peace and for harmony between people and communities as well. So happiness understood in that extended sense also. Meaning and happiness are related in interesting ways. The point I'm trying to make is, if asking questions is the way that you get people's attention, especially questions that expose that they're not nearly as thought out as they thought they were, and then what can make the next step of making Christianity attractive to people is that you present Jesus Christ in the context of what completes the thing that secularism is reaching for but doesn't achieve. But this is a different way of thinking about evangelism, isn't it? This is not learn my tract and then when the opportunity arises, launch. Right? That's not contextualized evangelism. Almost always that will be great faithfulness to the truth, totally counterproductive. Now, here's my favorite story in evangelism, okay? Does it work sometimes? Of course it does. Like this. My favourite story in evangelism is of a communist country where a Christian was reading her Bible in a train, and the conductor, a communist official, came past and wanted to see the tickets and saw that she was reading a Bible and got really angry at her and confiscated the Bible, okay, and threw it out the window. And walking beside the train was a peasant on a bike, I think riding a bike actually, and the Bible hit the peasant in the head. And the peasant stopped after, because he fell off the bike, stopped, picked himself up, saw what the projectile was. It was a book, took the book home, read the book, came to Christ, shared the book, whole village comes to Christ. I think this is a true story. This does not mean that your best evangelistic strategy is to throw Bibles at people out of trains. The Holy Spirit can use that if the Holy Spirit chooses to. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. But you just shouldn't throw Bibles at people out of trains. Don't do it. Bad idea. It can be that just launching into your tract presentation of the gospel leads people to Christ. I'm just telling you, most of the time it's going to make people hostile to Christ. It'll be counterproductive. We need to do better than that. And the way to do better than that is, at least we've started down this, is to ask questions in a post-Christian environment. How do we get people's attention at all in the first place? How do we make Christ attractive to people? And we'll come back to the next two questions tomorrow. We need to stop. We needed to stop a while ago.